I was fortunate enough to have several unique experiences that helped me understand more about local government and corruption and crime and how those operate in a rural area. So while the details of those experiences aren't that important, what is important are the patterns that emerge from that experience. Now on the chart there's this really long title for this talk, and when David and I were trying to figure out what this talk was actually going to have in it, there was a lot of fuzziness, a lot of enormous amount of content that I could put out here. And as I started developing this, it turned into a more simpler idea of selecting a rural area, and you'll see in a little bit how that relates to local government and risks that we face in a rural area specifically. So apologies for this not having the same title as what you have on the sheet there. The flow of this talk will be as follows. I'm going to mention some dangerous assumptions and outdated views that we think of that we've been taught our whole lives. The parallels between corruption at the federal and local levels. How selective enforcement of laws is used as a policy tool to control people. The different local government types and roles that they play. How local officials are indoctrinated to perform their job. And I'm sure people have had the experience of you get somebody elected, they're fine, 3 months later, what happened? I'm going to explain what happens. If you are in a rural area, whether or not you can say this is a good rural area or do I need to move, or for someone who's trapped in a subdivision, do they move to the rural areas? Where do they go? And some common warning signs to use to evaluate a rural area based on the crime and corruption. So why do we want to consider a rural area? There's several reasons. One is nostalgia. Everybody's got in their head this caveman idea that I can get back to the rural area and in the worst case I can grow my own food. There's also the bug out fantasy versus economic reality. Someone in a subdivision thinks, well, when it gets bad, I'm going to bug out to the countryside, and that'll be better than where I am. Well, one of the problems there is the economic reality of why you're in that subdivision in the first place, because that's where the money and the opportunity is. The gray man fantasy. I'm going to not be confrontational. I'm just going to hide. I'm just going to just go to the store every now and then, not talk to people. That runs into a conflict with this crime and corruption alliance I'm going to be talking about. The main short-term goal that I think is important is surviving to fight. You want to get to the rural area so that you can live past the short-term chaos, to be able to get to that next stage so that then you can influence the world around you in a way that's favorable to what we like to think of as civilization. And there's several security assumptions that people make about rural areas, that you're going to get better physical security there, you're going to get better energy security, you're going to get better food security. And that is true until you face a crime and corruption alliance. So the dangerous assumption number one is any rural area is better than my apartment, townhouse, subdivision. You will see people think that or say it on the web. That's not necessarily true. There are some times that your apartment, your townhouse, your subdivision is a better choice than a bad rural area. And I want to show how to figure that out. Mayberry is dead. It's not whatever era in the past that you think of fondly. I grew up in the 70s and 80s in rural southern Mississippi. I never knew of anybody who had anything stolen. There weren't meth addicts running around. There was corruption, but it wasn't like it is today. And it didn't have the tools that it has today. So Mayberry's dead. Put that thought out of your head. We're seeing increasing crime and corruption alliances, and these mirror what we see at the federal level. There's the meth and drug war, which has added new complications to the problem. And selective enforcement is a tool that is generally used against good people. There's dysgenic effects, and what I mean by dysgenic is driving populations to devolving, to lower capabilities, to lower character, to lower ability to solve problems for themselves. And these dysgenic effects are caused by state and federal grants and benefits, and access to information and personal mobility, and I'll discuss that more in a little bit. Bold assertion number one: if you live in a rural area where peacetime corruption is normal, then a criminal plus local corruption alliance may be the most dangerous threat you face during a significant crisis. You may not see that alliance, or it may not have a lot of impact on you, but when things go bad, that's when it's going to be a problem. And it's interesting that this risk can vary widely between even adjacent counties. You can have one county where the risk of this alliance is not bad, and you can have another county where it's just incredibly bad. And there's warning signs to be able to figure this out. And a relatively benign peacetime criminal and local corruption alliance can quickly go feral in a crisis. Now, the word for crisis, I think there's some Chinese background to that. The crisis is risk plus opportunity. When a crisis happens, that alliance will suddenly see, yes, there's risk, but there's also now more opportunity to seize more power and assets and impose its will upon people. Dangerous assumption number two: local corruption is harmless, almost boss hog kind of charming. Yeah, they're kind of stealing stuff, but they're not really bad, and he's kind of a cool guy, fun to hang out with at the fair. That's not true anymore. The local corruption threat now is very parallel to federal level corruption. We see the same kind of things going on that we complain about with the federal government, but at a smaller scale. It's sort of like the farm league for this federal level corruption. There's selective enforcement. Insiders don't get prosecuted, whereas outsiders, people who aren't politically connected, they have to watch every step. Exactly the same as we see at the federal level. There's increasing linkage control by drug crime gangs. There's linkage to underage and sex trafficking. There are several government entities, such as housing authorities, for example, that wind up farming destitute people, low-income people, for minor sex trafficking. And that's parallel to what we hear rumored about at the federal level. Diversion of growing public funds. For every dollar of public funds that is available out there, that's another 10 to 25 cents or more that can be diverted to skim and influence. So there's a tendency to want to have growing public funds available, bigger projects, whatever, just so that there's more skim to throw around. There's increasing regulatory tools, from environmental stuff to workplace regulations, that make it more and more difficult for Joe Blow to run Blowco to provide for his family, but instead he's forced more and more into a job working for somebody else, and we'll see with the company town concept how that's very beneficial to corruption. There's an entrenched us versus them mentality with this alliance, where the guy who gets elected 3 months later, now he's part of this group that you wanted to get rid of in the first place, which is why you elected him. And there's a diversion of post 9/11 emergency management funds and capabilities, tools, resources. We'll see some of that in a little bit also. So that's the threat. That's the pattern of the threat of the local corruption. Now, in rural Georgia, I often heard this selective enforcement quote: "The sheriff will get me off for anything but rape or murder." If you think about the implications of that, that's pretty profound. If a guy feels like he's so politically connected that he can do anything he wants except rape or murder, he's going to get away with it. So the only reason rape and murder is on the list is because in Georgia, supposedly, the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigations, is called in to handle those cases. That can break down also. But the guy that has that idea in his head, that's a big problem. And a bigger problem is, how did he get that idea in his head in the first place? Here's an emergency management example. Let's say there's a crisis on the horizon. There's a hurricane coming, and the governor says, we're going to have a state of emergency. Now, as soon as the governor declares a state of emergency, the button gets pushed on a lot of downstream consequences of that. And one is that the local authority can then declare things like a curfew. What does a curfew mean? Curfew means you're supposed to stay in your house, right? What does this have to do with the Crime Corruption Alliance? Well, it means now the criminals are free to roam, steal, or do worse. Because of selective enforcement, they can go out and do whatever they want. You know, if you've got a business, you've got to stay in your house, they can raid your business. If you've got an elderly parent, you can't go protect that person. They can then get raided and robbed and beat up, and you can't do anything about it. You're stuck. Transients going through that area is like refugees fleeing the hurricane. Now they're on a highway. Now normally if they're on an interstate, they're free from harassment. But if they get off the interstate to look for gas, and everybody ahead of them has already gotten all the gas, now they got to go farther inland off the interstate route. Now they're subject to being a curfew violator. So that means they can be legally fined, robbed by these gangs of criminals that nobody's doing anything about. And worse for the people who live in that area is, let's say you're a prepper and you decided to store up generator, fuel, food. Well, if you have a state of emergency, those local authorities can come to your house, take that stuff, give you a piece of paper that says, yeah, they took it. But is it going to go to the people that it's intended to go to? No. It's just going to go into the larder of these other guys, and they're going to be then using this with these criminal gangs to barter or sell. They'll be selling those supplies and pocketing cash. They will be doing the scalping or whatever of all that material. And good luck getting that stuff back. Yeah, you got a piece of paper that says they took it, but hey, you know, things happen. So that is a risk now for anybody who's a prepper, that they can come in a state of emergency and seize your stuff. So dangerous assumption number 3 is the feds are going to keep this under control. So I don't have to worry about that, right? The federal influence on this problem is that, for one, the local oversight by the feds is extra constitutional. There's not really an authority there. People think that the federal government should be doing that, but really they don't. They don't have an authority to do that, and they will often use that as a reason to not get involved. Second, I think it's fairly clear that recent events teach us that Fed.gov is a deep state or globalist asset. It really doesn't respond to us anymore. It responds to the more powerful people, the international banksters, whatever. It's not our asset, it's theirs. They love to terraform rural areas, but not in a way that we would like. And getting them involved is like a deal with the devil, sort of the Marxist dialectic thing. Where did the problem come in the first place? The problem came from policies and regulations that they enacted, so it's probably not a good idea to get them involved in the solution. So a rural area has to be viable on its own, not only during the time of federal oversight, because during a crisis to increase chaos, a great tool of the globalists or the deep state would just simply be to withdraw the federal support. So now you're on your own. So we have to adopt the idea that we're on our own anyway and figure out what to do, how to recognize that bad area and what we might want to do about it. Another dangerous assumption is, well, if the feds aren't going to do anything, the state will keep everything under control. Here's a thought experiment. Where do all those state officials come from? In general, they come from that same system that produces this corrupt local government and crime alliance. So expecting those people to do anything significant probably isn't a good idea either. So before I get into some of the details about how these alliances come about, I want to talk about some local government types and how to recognize the advantages and disadvantages of each. I put a homeowners association on here at the top because even though it's not really a government, they have the ability to make people with guns show up to enforce their will, so think of it like a government. There's also municipalities, authorities, boards, county governments, and tribal governments, which I don't have enough experience with to comment on, so I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so homeowners associations. The model of a homeowner association is very similar to a municipality or a city. They have civil authority only. There's no criminal sanctions that they can impose. Older subdivisions may be time limited in their viability of their association. Sometimes these things expire after 30 years or whatever, but that's more and more rare. Charter by majority, covenants unanimous. What that means is that they can change the way they operate with a majority vote, but they can't make new laws. The laws are what they are. Their restrictions are what they are. They're not going to get any worse. So in that regard, they're probably better than a city, because at least they're not going to be able to say, target you, and I'm going to pass a new law and make you have to leave. Right? So they are good in that respect, because every one of you gets a veto power over that new regulation. It's possible to rally support of neighbors in a subdivision in a crisis. You're kind of all in the same boat. So as things get worse, it's going to be a lot easier, because you have a kind of already a homogeneous blend of interests. It's going to be easier to rally people to form neighborhood protection teams. Rural subdivisions may have enough land per lot where you could grow chickens or do some aquaponics or put up some solar panels or whatever. You may have to keep those things squirreled away and hidden until it all falls apart. But at least you have enough land in some of these more rural areas to be able to put some self-sufficiency things in place. Many of these subdivisions in rural areas will have their own well and water infrastructure. I've lived in several subdivisions that have had that. They got their own pump, got their own well. All you got to do is just keep the thing running, have enough fuel for it, some spare parts. You could keep your own water system going. A subdivision can be more cost-effective than a pure rural lot. Sometimes you get a better quality of life than that, than in a pure rural area. And the fact that it's all a compact geographical thing with limited access makes it more easy to defend it in a crisis, especially against mounted threats. Okay, municipalities and cities, charters and patterns for these are all over the map. It's not, there's not really one set pattern for the way that these things operate. A city goes into the state and says, here's how we want to run ourselves. A city is usually dominated by some key economic factor, especially in the small cities. Anything under about 1,000 is probably the most malignant corruption you're going to see in cities. It's too small for it to be self-sufficient economically. They're grant vampires, which means they're going out and getting lots of money from the state and federal government to try to run their operations without having their own self-sufficient tax base. And many of these things just turn into family businesses, where there's a small group of people that run the government and they don't want anybody else involved. They're almost always a bad choice for your core team or base. But it's okay to use a city locations sometimes if you want to have some sort of resource there that you want to use for other purposes, like maybe a business to have your guys working at. But you generally don't want to put your core team in any city. I think that should be off the table immediately. And one of the reasons for that is because they can single out individuals or small groups of people. They can draw a box around the law that says, okay, basically, what you're doing, we don't want that. Authorities and boards. These are, you've heard of like airport authorities or prison boards or library boards. These are special case oversight bodies, and they all have all the disadvantages that the city has. But they also have the additional disadvantage of their control of them is unelected. You never get to vote for these people in most cases. So a bunch of other people you don't know appoint these authorities. I use the example of a housing authority. That is just like a gravy train for people who get appointed to that. They have an enormous amount of power and influence, especially over low-income people. And I believe it's the most corrupt form of local government. Now, fortunately, housing isn't really a big issue in those. People in this room probably aren't going to wind up in a housing authority, or you're not going to wind up under the control of like a library board or airport authority. But you may live next to them. And so they will be like the, if you're next to an airport, they can decide to petition the county to pass special restrictions within, say, a few miles. People who do amateur radio are already aware of some of those. But they could get the county to say, we don't want anybody shooting guns within so many miles or whatever. There's lots of ways that they can use their authority outside of the scope of their geographical influence to affect you and your team. So it's a good idea to try to be away from those things, because the farther away you are, the less likely they are to have their spillover regulations. The county, I believe this is the preferred governing type for the rural area. There are some exceptions. These, I believe, will retain their fundamental character in any crisis. The zoning codes restrictions vary widely and even vary over time. Generally, they're a cookie-cutter organization, though. The raw fundamental nature of how they operate is the same inside the state. There's very little variation, whereas a city can have a wide variation in the organization. They're too large to easily target individuals or small groups with oppressive regulations. If they try to draw a box around you in a county, there's usually enough people that fit that pattern. They're going to generate a lot of hate and discontent. Whereas if they were able to box you in with some regulation, then they can just single you out and everybody else is not going to really care. Okay, so a county government, it can be beneficial if it's on the low end of the corruption spectrum. They have a lot of resources, they've got equipment, they've got people trained to maintain infrastructure. So they're not necessarily going to be bad, and they can actually be a benefit if they're not heavily corrupted already. And it is generally the fundamental unit for emergency management. Okay, so trivia question. What is the primary responsibility of the county sheriff? Who would like to answer that? Anybody?
Warrants.
Run the jail.
Run the jail, okay, not bad.
Warrants.
Warrants, not bad.
Protect the courts.
Protect the courts, good one. Any others?
Public safety.
Public safety, a good one. Any?
That's like the number one.
Okay.
State Tennessee.
Any others?
To promote the myth of the central authority.
Okay, that's not bad. Okay, I'm going to give you a hint. 2 hints. One, this role survives from feudal times. If you think of feudal sheriff, what he did, what is his job? And not doing this can generally get him replaced by the state government. Any ideas?
Collect taxes.
Tax collection.
Ooh, now we're starting to get close. Boom, lien enforcement. Taxes, civil, mortgages, other debt, foreclosures, eviction, that's his job. His job is not law enforcement. Law enforcement is the marketing that is applied to that position, because if he doesn't enforce the law, if he doesn't chase down the criminal, if he doesn't respond to your police report, he's not going to get in trouble for that. Hence, the sheriff will get me off for anything other than regular murder. But if he doesn't enforce a lien from Chase Manhattan, that will get him fired. The sheriff is not there to protect you. If he does, it's a bonus. His job is to make sure you pay the bank. That's it. Dangerous assumption number 5. My county government works for me. You would think that would be the case, right? They're your neighbors, they're your locals, right? They work for you, they understand your needs. Well, they do until they attend this state mandated training. Most states have mandated local official training that they have to go to. It's basically indoctrination. Most elected local officials and many of the key hires or appointees, like the secretaries of the various bodies, they have to go to them. I'm not being sarcastic about this. This next bit of the puzzle here is from observations. Ethics training turns out to be minimal compliance, say nothing, see nothing. The Sergeant Schultz, I don't know, cone of silence kind of thing. They will get in more trouble for ratting out their fellow official than they will by misbehaving. Public affairs in this training is about dealing with troublemakers. It's not using your authority and your position responsibly to benefit the community. It's what do you do when that guy shows up at the public meetings? How do you handle it? That's public affairs. There's hidden layers of legal supports, tips, and tricks that they learn. And they get indoctrinated with you are special, you're important, your community cannot survive without you. So they get a sense of entitlement. And every now and then, to make sure that they haven't forgotten any of this, they get refresher courses. This is something that most people aren't aware happens. They usually go to it, some offices go to it before they take office, some offices go to it 1 to 3 months after they take office. But this is why suddenly it's like this guy has had a brain transplant. What happened? This is what happened. And most people aren't aware that this exists. These local official associations are another piece of the puzzle of their indoctrination, and those are usually tied in hand in glove with the official training. There are corporate associations, so you probably have seen some indication of this, like you'll see the Clerk of Courts Association, the Sheriff's Association, the municipal associations. All of these are like clubs that your membership is that you are one of these public officials. And so these guys, they get together in a room like this, and they start complaining about what's going on with their troublemaker. They start getting more ideas about more money and grants they can get. And they sell this to the public by saying you're getting training and benefits. You know, the public is going to get lower rates on insurance for your public officials, and that sounds good. But what they don't tell you is this copyrighted proprietary information that gets disseminated to these people during these meetings. And there's an incestuous training, lobby, and funding relationship, because the dues for these associations, guess who pays the dues? You do. It comes out of your tax money. They will pass a funding measure in the city council.
Guess who pays for the travel to?
Exactly. You pay for the travel, you pay for the lodging. So this private association is a corporation generally. It has owners, and it may be set up as a nonprofit. We all know nonprofits are ripe for abuse. So this corporation that's not a public entity gets public officials voting to fund it, fund their dues, fund their training, buy their training materials, and in return, this organization agrees to protect these officials as much as they can, in terms of giving them training materials to say, hey, if you have this problem, this is what you do. If you're caught doing X, they present it as these are the consequences. But basically, the message is how to avoid the consequences. And there's this reinforcement of us versus them, and now the us includes these associations. Not just we're public officials, but now we're a club, we're a team. We're all sitting in this room together. We need to look out for each other. And imagine teachers' unions on steroids. Everybody's heard about teachers' unions and how bad those can be. Now add to that, they're multi-layered. Every layer of official gets one of these associations. They're pervasive. All of them are in it, and it's statewide. They have their own officers, president, treasurer, secretary, whatever for their local area. They have a regional thing. They'll have a statewide organization. So they've got this hierarchy, this structure in place, that it's now a new entity that is outside direct control of the public. And it's backed by law, because the law says you've got to have this training. And so there's a legal basis for these organizations to exist. And they're proprietary, meaning that these private companies, their training materials are trade secrets. If you were elected and you gave out this material to the public, they could sue you because it's not public information, it's their information, their tips and tricks. And it's outside the reporting rules that would normally apply to government information. So you and the public are almost never going to actually see this stuff, or you're going to see a sanitized, condensed version of it. Who here has ever heard the idea of a janissary? Sir, would you like to?
Mercenaries.
Okay, well, not bad. A janissary is a guy who gets pulled out of his local community, indoctrinated by the empire, and then plugged back in as an agent of that empire. Sometimes they swap localities, so that some guy comes from over here, doesn't really have any loyalty to people over there, but the idea is you take someone out of the populace, you train them to serve the purposes of the empire, and you put them back in place. Because locals will then adopt that guy, because hey, he's one of us, right? How bad is it going to be? So this training process that these officials go to shortly after taking office is very equivalent to that. It's an almost exact model of that same situation. which means by default, you can't just assume they work for you. They may, but you can't just say, well, because they're from our community, that they will. Local control is then an illusion. And because the county government has this feudal element, its primary role is feudal land lease collection and keeping the rabble under control. The populace has the responsibility to offset this offset this official and insider influence. And you can do this a couple ways. One, you start going to the meetings. That has its own interesting implications. You can also have social contact. The guy who had the brain transplant, you may not want to hang out with him like you did last year, but you really need to keep hanging out with him, even though he's just gotten a barrel. He needs that social contact to bring him back into the fold, or to start weaning him off of that us versus them, especially that now you are armed with the knowledge of what he's been through. You know that he's been brainwashed. You know he's been indoctrinated. And you know that most normal human beings in that situation are going to start responding to that indoctrination. Well, how do you get somebody out of a cult? You bring them back into the fold in contact. You don't show them away. You bring them back in. So now let's get back to how this crime and corruption alliance works and how you can recognize it. Knowing that the local officials aren't on your side by default, but you're going to have to work to bring them back on your side. Keep in mind that law enforcement is optional. It's contraindicated for corrupt areas, which means it's not going to happen. You're not going to get effective law enforcement when there's corruption. Instead, selective enforcement is the rule. Law enforcement will also provide cover for criminal elements. Then the criminals become the guided terror weapons. Non-criminals become the targets of regulations. Now, what about all these janissaries? Are they going to get police protection? You bet. They're going to get the primo police protection. That's one of the benefits they get from being a janissary. You and I, out on the street, we're not going to get that police protection. So we can't think that, well, because Councilman A had the police show up in droves when somebody stole a pie off of his aunt's window, that anything's going to happen in your benefit when something much more severe happens to you. So the emerging trend is they are policy enforcement agents now. They are not law enforcement officers. If you think of them that way, then it makes it much more palatable to understand how they behave, and you're not going to be frustrated and angry anymore. And if you do need to have contact with a public official, what you need to not do is be angry. Instead, you need to recognize what their training has been, what their indoctrination has been. The fact that there are two levels of law enforcement. There's law enforcement and there's policy enforcement. And you're only receiving end of policy enforcement. That alone will make you less angry and aggravated and filled with some sort of righteous indignation that it's not supposed to be this way. Well, of course it's not supposed to be this way. But it is this way. That will then make you more effective at bringing people back into the fold. It is possible to decriminalize an area from this crime and corruption alliance, but it's best done from an adjacent county. It requires established teams, resources, and planning. It requires popular support in both the base and the target counties. And it requires hardening facilities against these targeted criminal threats and raids, because one of the things they're going to do to try to weaken resistance to the corruption alliance is they're going to target those people with raids and then not enforce the law about the consequences. So you're going to have to harden your facilities against those raids. And there's some ways to do that. The details of all this is beyond the scope of the current talk, but I just wanted to point out you can do decriminalization. And an unconventional warfare enthusiast will recognize all of these elements. And unconventional warfare is not about Rambo going in and to liberate the natives. It's about encouraging the natives to themselves, oftentimes through peaceful means. Now, how do we pick a rural area? How do we judge the rural area? Well, in my book, what I'm looking for is three things. I'm looking for the people, I'm looking for the resources, and I'm looking for the climate. Let's handle those backwards. Climate factors such as, is it too cold to survive winter after poor harvest? Is it too little cold for these beneficial life cycles that need to happen? Is it too hot to work in summer? That's not just a lazy thing. Some areas of the country are just simply too hot to get anything effective done, and so people wind up kicking back or throttling back, doing work in the summertime. Too little rain to support agriculture, and the dysgenic effects of welfare and subsidies. If there is welfare flowing into an area, then people are not going to want to work, and that's fairly obvious. If there are subsidies flowing into an area, they're not going to be as effective and productive. Now, the resource side of this, three-legged stool here, is too few resources means there's too much economic consolidation. Narrow economic opportunity hampers freedom of action because it's like a company town. Joe Bob isn't going to be able to say, no, I'm not going to look the other way. Because if he does, if he says he's going to stand up for truth and justice, he's going to lose his job, and because it's company town, he's not going to get a job anywhere else. So any of these areas that have this company town mentality, they're going to be much more likely to be corrupt than a place which has a more diverse economy. Is there major chain stores? Are there different ways that the area produces economic output? Is it just one crop or a small set of crops? There's a dysgenic effect of mobility and grants and drug war. These areas that have thin resources are traditionally corrupt, and areas that have now marginal resources, it used to just be the really thin resource places were the corrupt ones. Now the ones with the marginal resources are now corrupt because there's all of these grants and drug war funds flowing into the area that make it easier to be corrupt than it is to extract those incremental resources. Now the people factors. There is a trend towards tribalism. That is a natural response for people that are experiencing social upheaval, that are experiencing social stresses. They're going to get more tribal. And some of the information that we're going to be presenting this weekend is going to be addressing that tribalism. Us versus them, the people I know, the people I grew up with. The problem with the guy in the subdivision is going to have is when he goes to that rural area, he's not part of that tribe. He's outside of that tribe. If he lands in a bad area, he's a victim on day one. Even he may have the best intentions. He may be wanting to help the people, may be wanting to support their culture, may be wanting to teach them new things that they don't know, but he's an outsider because they've gotten more tribal because of the stresses they're under. These corrupt elements take advantage of that tribalism against outsiders by saying, oh, they're not one of us. Yeah, it's okay to steal from them. I actually overheard a preacher once say that it is okay to steal if Jesus tells you to. Think of the impact that, combined with the sheriff will get me off for anything other than rape or murder, starts having on people's psyche, if then the people with all of the influence are the only places you can go to get a job. The rural areas are also having growing crime tolerance. Meth, drug war gravy for law enforcement for one thing. Two, it's a way that people can indigenously produce wealth. They don't need to import anything from South America. They can just get some chemicals in and do it themselves. So selective enforcement, they can look the other way when the materials flow in, do the manufacturing, look the other way when the finished product flows out. Theft is another big growing crime problem in the rural areas, and that's basically insurance fraud. You'll see institutions, people get raided over and over. They just go file their insurance report and insurance claim. And usually the role of law enforcement is just to fill out the report so that the insurance company will pay off. So this is a growing problem. This makes people more tolerant of theft. So it also makes people growing more tolerant of the corruption, because the corrupt organization is what is the command and control element in some cases. Sometimes the criminals themselves are command and control, depending on the relationships. But hey, I'm going to get some freebies from this insurance fraud, so sure, God looks the other way. That is something that when I was growing up, it was incomprehensible that such a thing would be possible. But it is the growing trend. Now, the salt of the earth people, the people who are normally opposed to this, they are so economically battered, and they are so culturally battered, that they feel alone. They don't feel like they can do anything about it. And so they tend to just shrink into the background. That's another place where we have the responsibility to reach out to those people, get them involved so that they know they're not alone. You're not just hounded by every influence in society. We are here. We're a team. We're going to work through this together. We may not be powerful enough to do anything about the corruption today, but we understand where it's coming from, and we're going to be working towards a solution tomorrow. We need to get those salt of the earth people on the team, if for no other reason than the psychological advantage of them having somewhere to be. This situation is growing a sense of frustration, and it's a powder keg. What we want is not when the powder keg goes off, for the people in the margins to flip over to the corruption because they look like the successful team. We want, when the powder keg goes off, those people on the margins flip over to us because we have a plan. We understand what the enemy's plan is. We understand how they got that way. We understand how they were indoctrinated. We know them better than they know us. They think they know us because they've been able to get away with it for so long. But they don't really know us. But we know them. So we want those people on the margins to say, I'm going to go with the team that's going to win in the future. I understand that the world is the way it is now, but that's not necessarily the way it's always going to be. So is it nature or nurture? I believe that the people and their culture, and I capitalize those on purpose, the people and their culture are the fundamental resource, but these have been shaped by resources and climate. They've been molded almost by deliberate action to be weakened, to be demoralized, to be atomized, to have everything they believe in, have the rug yanked out from under it. So the people and their culture have been shaped, have been engineered. We can start unengineering that. And these dysgenic factors that have shaped them have been magnified by federal spending, mass media values, regulatory legal environment, and selective enforcement. Again, reaching out to people and saying, we know why this is happening. That's helpful. So let's talk about some warning signs. How do you identify a rural area that's a problem? If you ever hear the question, who are your people? That's a warning sign. It used to be when I was growing up, who are you people meant? How were you raised? Were you on the right side of the tracks when you were raised? Did they take you to church? Did you learn the right way? Oh, you're a Jones? Okay, I know you're good. Are you a Smith? Well, I'll give you a chance, but I'm going to be watching. That's what that question used to mean. Now it means, if we steal from you, will there be blowback? That's the problem the guy in the subdivision has. He has no people. There will be blowback. There will be no blowback for him if he gets victimized. Okay? So, if someone asks you that, if you're going to a rural area and you're interviewing it, basically, is this somewhere I want to be? And you have people asking you, who are your people? Big warning sign. Does it have a company town, company county feel? Is there like just this one or two industry that's run by the same people? Are there only third-tier chain stores? And I use Dollar General as an example, but it's a great store. I buy lots of stuff there. I'm not running them down, but they seem to somehow have the ability, like the nuclear war cockroach, to be able to survive in areas no other store will touch. Even worse is the area where the Dollar General goes out of business. If you see the cockroaches don't then that's a bad spot. Okay, is the real estate price below statistical expectations? You're sitting in your subdivision house and, hey, I want to go out of the country. I'm going, wow, that place is cheap. And look, it's got all this land, the house is nice. Wow, I can live there and it'd be awesome. Well, there's a reason it's cheap. Are most of the candidates unopposed in general elections? You might think, hey, the unopposed candidate's all right. The guy's doing a good job. Nobody wants to run against him. No, because he's been handpicked as that guy. for the alliance. Maybe he's the replacement for the previous handpicked guy, and nobody's running against him. You see a bunch of that happening, and there'll be some cases where there'll be a few officials here and there where no, they're not running opposed. That's not what I'm talking about. When you see mostly the slate is always unopposed, or it's two guys that your information shows just kind of flip back and forth, and it's just like, hey, who's going to get it? Then you know that's a problem. If you drive around and you see that most yards have nothing in them, but there's a few yards that look really good, it's got lots of stuff. Selective enforcement. The people who are in most of the yards are concerned, hey, somebody's going to steal my stuff, so I'm going to hide it. But the guy who's getting the selective enforcement in his favor, he can just have stuff all over. Nobody's going to steal from that guy, and if they do, they're going to get it back. If you see that pattern, that's an important thing. Okay, so pop quiz. County A has a low crime rate and low real estate prices. Adjacent County B has a high theft rate, higher real estate prices, and a large number of drug-related arrests. Which one do you pick? Who says A? Anybody? A few? Who says B? All right. Okay. County B is the better choice. County A is lying. All rural areas now have meth crime. That is a fact of life. County B is the victim of cross-border raids by County A criminals. That's why their crime rate is so high. Cross-border raids are a real thing. These guys can shoot across the border, steal stuff, jump back. Sheriff will protect them from anything other than regular murder. The real estate prices is where you can see the truth. If you had to choose between a subdivision home on a couple of acres outside city limits in County B versus a purely rural place in County A, your best choice is that subdivision home in County B. For another thing, the County B people are going to be inclined to team with you. They're going to be more inclined to say, we don't like this crime. We don't like, they won't articulate it as cross-border raids. They may not even know it. They just know they're getting their stuff stolen, they don't like it. Nobody ever gets caught. So this, by the way, would be one of the cases where it would be better to live in a subdivision than it would be in a pure rural location. Okay, more warning signs. Crime reporting anomalies. You see this area where, wow, there is no crime. That's an anomaly. There's crime everywhere. They're just not telling you about it, or people are too afraid to report it. Or the statements, we don't have crime here. That's like a robotic reaction, and often you'll hear that said with a smile and snicker like, oh, we don't have any crime here. Sure, go ahead and move here. Because they're in on the alliance themselves. They're waiting for you to come so they can steal your stuff. So they say, oh, there's no crime. Glowing local media accounts of officials. This is one of those things where the local mirrors the federal. You'll see these, you read the local paper, you'll see just this guy is just, wow, he's the most heroic local official. He heals sick babies, whatever. You start seeing that kind of stuff, that's a problem. Because that means local media is probably controlled. And in many cases, they'll also have, just like the federal level, controlled opposition. Sometimes you'll have this radical website that's going out and pointing out problems with what's going on with the local officials. Oftentimes, especially if you look behind the scenes of who owns that radical website, it will probably be someone connected to the same problem. So what they're doing there is they're using that controlled opposition not to go after the real problems, but instead they're going after the defectors. The people that are getting arrested for public crimes, the people that are like stealing from the treasury or whatever, the people that are getting arrested or investigated by, for any other public offense, the people who are, that is happening to in this corrupt area, those are the guys who are saying, no, stop. So they've defected against the alliance and now they get targeted. And they get targeted by the controlled opposition. Okay, authority or board members that receive disproportionate media attention or praise. Some guy who's on the prison board, some guy who's on the library board, somebody who's guys on the airport authority. Is this guy really out in the public doing all these great things? Probably not. But he's got this spotlight on him like, oh, he's so great. Don't look at his budgets. Sharp population cutoff at 18 to 20 years old. This is that dysgenic effect of information availability and mobility. If you're a college guy, if you're a skilled tradesman, and you have the internet and you know the rest of the world isn't like this place, what are you going to do when you get old enough? You're going to go, right? So if you see population, if you look at some demographics and there's like a sharp cutoff in population drops precipitously at that age range where they can get out and go, they are telling you they've spent their whole life so far examining the situation, and mom is probably even saying, get out, go somewhere else. I don't want you to grow up in this. Abnormal number of burned out rural structures from all these meth labs that caught fire. Because all the smart kids that could have done chemistry or all the trained tradesmen that could have built it safely, they're not there anymore doing it. So the guy that's left, the dysgenic remnant, he's blowing up the trailer. And nobody's bothering to fix them. Okay, more warning signs. Surprise at your attendance at public meetings. If you start going to the county meetings, you start going to the city meetings, and everybody's looking at you like you just, what is this guy? What is he doing here? Why is he here? That's a sign, because that means people aren't getting involved. Generally, people will get involved in these public meetings, either when it's going really well because they're kind of guiding things, or when it's going really poorly. Right? No. It's the other way around, right? People only show up at meetings when they've got enough pain that they want to get involved. When things are going great, nobody cares. Living their life. When things are going poorly, and it's with this Crime Correction Alliance, they know better than to show up. So if you show up at one of those two spectrum ends, it's either going bad, you're going to get this, what are you doing here? Or you're going to get a, wow, thank you for coming because we are doing a good job and we'd like for the public to be here. You'll get one of those reactions. They're polar opposites. If you get that, what in the world, then you know it's a problem area. Unnecessary lies. You walk around and people are lying to you about anything and giggling about it. They probably have a strong crime corruption alliance going on because lies, deception, that's their life. And so they don't just lie about the crime, they'll lie about anything. So if you start hearing these unnecessary lies, then you know that's a problem. Prison clusters. An area may have a prison, but if it's drawn in just gobs of them, every time you turn around there's another prison, that's another problem. That means that this slave trade mentality has taken root. And finally, if it's a dry county. Why? Selective enforcement. Dry counties are dry not because of any moral reasons anymore. They're dry because it gives the officials leverage. Even if you don't drink, it's easier to just toss a beer bottle in your car and say, oh, he's transporting, right? It may be more difficult, probably not, but it may be more difficult to try to set somebody up for a drug offense, but easy to set somebody up for an alcohol offense in a dry county. And then you can either get prosecuted for this or move or whatever, or give us, serve the alliance or whatever it may be, right? So dry counties are a huge problem here in 2018, a huge warning sign here in 2018. So for review, we talked about some dangerous assumptions and outdated views. We looked at the parallels between the local and the federal situation, how selective enforcement is used as a policy tool, different local government types, the role they play, the local official indoctrination process that has turned them into janissaries, how to select a rural area, and some of the crime and corruption warning signs. And it boils down to this. Will I fight for these people? If you can't say yes to that question, you really need to be living somewhere else. Now, that's the end of the formal presentation. Are there any questions? Sir.
Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Made me think of Buford Fusser.
Right.
What if you live in a county that's A plus B? It's mixed.
It's
One
on
town
the
is
edge.
one way and one town's the other way, right next door.
That's a good question. If it's municipalities, that is a special case. I'm glad you brought that up. A county with municipalities stuck inside it, where one municipality's bad, another municipality's okay. The alliance is probably headquartered in the OK City. They don't want that crap in their yard around their kids, so they keep it clean. But they're running the alliance through these other municipalities. So that, I'm glad you brought that up. That is an important question. Teal?
Can I just make a statement?
Sure.
In supporting and verifying and validating everything you just said, George Gramlich up in Custer County, Colorado, him and his Patriot group got in, dug deep into that county, got rid of the 3 county commissioners, actually 2 of them, and had the other guy so rattled that he may have quit.
Right.
Now, all you really do is replace them with somebody else. But the point is, they are very tight with their Patriot group, is very tight with the sheriff's department, and very tight with what's going on, and everybody's pretty much, there's a lot. You walk around up there in Custer County, especially West Cliff, where he's based out of, and it's not uncommon to see people open carrying all the time.
Right.
Not even uncommon. And a
Right.
lot of people are being attracted to that county because of that. But it goes like you said. They went into the county commission office or meetings, every single one of them, until they saw what these guys. Now, all of these were Republicans, theoretically. They had
Right.
the R by their name, and it meant nothing. They were Democrats who wanted to run things, trying to set up exactly what you're talking about. I mean, 100% what you're talking about. But that's a good case study in how you flip it.
Right. That's exactly right. Right. You brought up a lot of great points there. One, party doesn't matter.
No.
Absolutely irrelevant. Just a shield depending on what the prevailing area is. That's
Right.
it. Another thing is getting involved and collecting the intelligence about what is actually happening, and then taking action on that intelligence. Related to that is I had an opportunity to spend some time with the Free State Project up in New Hampshire. And one of the things that these guys did very, very well, these guys do a lot of good stuff along these lines, and some of what we're talking about here came from them. They don't need to control every seat in the House. All they need to do is have the credible threat that they can replace you, that they can target your seat and take it away from you. If you can credibly make that political threat to someone's position, that we can remove you from office, you don't have to own every seat. You just have to have the ability to own any seat that you choose. And that means you got to get involved.
So your point is you have to blackmail our elected officials to do their job?
No,
I
not
know.
blackmail at all. What you have to do is you have to expose to the public what they're doing. Now, if it's a good area, exposing them to the public accomplishes the objective, but you got to get in there and see what they're doing. You expose them to the public, and then the rest of them learn, well, I better listen to the political influence of these people, because they can replace me too. I wouldn't call that blackmail, that's the political process. That's the world we live in. They are very good at that, and it's a impressive thing to see happen. And it sounds like those guys that you're talking about did exactly that. They've shown they're credible and that they can replace these 3. And now anybody else that shows up, they've got to keep that in mind.
This little town has 800 people in it, and 2 newspapers.
Right.
Because that's where he started.
Right.
He bought a newspaper, and they had the other newspaper, and he just kind of started that newspaper.
Right.
So that he could shine the spotlight on what was going on.
Right.
But the other thing is, it's very important. And this is one of the things about, if you're going to do this, when you choose to live in these places like you've outlined, you need to be a citizen of that place. You know what I'm saying? You can't just come there and live. Okay, well, this is my house, this is where I go, da, 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 da.
Right.
I mean, those guys are at every county commission meeting, every town board meeting. They're there watching, seeing how, it's a maintenance thing. It's not, you know,
Right. Now, I would, like.
I'm a hypocrite on that, but
Right. I would like to bounce something off of that idea. This goes back to is it a good area, is it not a good area? If it's not a good area, be in a good area. If it's a good area and there's some renegades that are starting to want to make it go bad, that's when you get involved and challenge their elections and things like that. But if it is a bad area, I believe it is a mistake to put your base inside that bad area. That you need to have your base outside the bad area. So that way, and by base I mean your main team, their families, it needs to be outside the corrupt area. So that you can liberate the people that are inside the corrupt area, and you can go to the county meetings. You can publish on your website what's going on. You don't have to be there to go. You don't have to be a citizen of that county to go to those meetings. You don't have to be a citizen of the county to do the publication. You can be like fire support for the people that are living there that may be too afraid, and we're getting off into this other topic, but and again, that's a entirely separate, bigger topic. But if it's a marginal area that can be made good, then yeah, going to all those meetings and keeping it good or shoving it in the right direction, that's a good thing.
This town probably is best for the roundtable later on, so I
That's
just want
a
to
good
cue it
one.
out for you.
Right.
But I'd like you and other speakers and all attendees to kind of think about either as the newcomer or having newcomers come in there, what's the cycle time for getting enough into a new community so you can make either the stay or go decision, and how long before you get accepted enough to be able to talk to the locals about, we really don't have to live like this. So just think about that
Yeah,
for later.
that's a good topic for that discussion. Right.
Because I grew up in upstate New York. My mom was from there multiple generations, but she left. And because she left, even though she came back 14 years later with her family to live on her father's farm, she was now an outsider. Because she married an outsider, her kids were outsiders. And so there's a lot of interesting human
Right.
psychology to that, which I think affects your ability to effect political change or other change.
Right.
40 years ago, I built in a community where I felt that way. And because of turnover in real estate, I'm now the entire outlier in that community.
That's an unfortunate fact, yes. But yes to your first question, and I empathize with your second statement. Last question, Josh.
So I have some insight into this because my wife was a city clerk for two separate cities in Gwinnett County, Georgia. So I've seen the inside of this from what goes on at these little small cities. One of the things to be aware of is you talk about going to the council meetings and whatnot. Sorry, I'm dealing with a little bit of a cold. The work for the council is not done at the council meeting. It's done at what's called the executive session, which generally happens before the council meeting. That's where all the decisions are actually made, and those are not open to the public. However, there are notes that are taken, and those should be available through an open records request. So if you want to see what's really kind of going on inside of the city that you're living in or the county, the open records request is like FOIA for local government.
Right.
And it is your weapon to get that information. Now, they might push back. They might charge you exorbitant fees, say, oh, well, we're going to charge you so many, $1 a copy or something stupid like that if it's a big, decision. But just be prepared for those kinds of things. You'll get those open records requests. That tool helped get rid of the police chief in the city that my wife worked at. People did some open records requests. They found out about some of the things that had gone on, and they ended up having to fire the police chief. So it is something that can be utilized
Right.
to your advantage.
Right. That is a great tool until it hits the far end of that Crime Corruption Alliance, in which case they're just gonna completely ignore it.
Yeah.
It's the middle ground, you can push it in the good direction using that tool. Good point, thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, for your attention, I appreciate it.